Sorry. By way of introduction, this is our legislative update panel. We have Representative Ray Ward and Anna Thomas here to talk to you about some of the stuff that has been going on in the legislature. Representative Ward was elected to the House of Representatives in 2014. He is also a family physician. One of his primary focuses in his medical practice is assisting folks who have a narcotic addiction. Representative Ward is joining us to discuss a piece of legislation that went through the legislature this session regarding school safety. Anna Thomas is a policy analyst for a Utah nonprofit, Voices for Utah Children. Anna previously served in many roles with the ACLU of Utah, working on criminal justice reform advocacy and community outreach, as well as development and media relations. Anna is here to discuss legislation. The piece is SB 32 and an amendment specifically that speaks to appointing counsel for youth in delinquency proceedings. So we have a few questions for you all. And first, Representative Ward, if you could please give us a quick overview of your piece of legislation. Why did you think it was important to sponsor this piece of legislation?
Sure. The HB 120 kind of started, actually not this session, but the whole session before. Following the Parkland shooting, there was kind of an outcry for the legislature to do something, but that happened kind of part of the way through the session. And so instead of rushing something through right at that time, there was the Utah Safe Schools Commission that was put together, which was an ad hoc commission, and they made some recommendations. Their top recommendation related to having evidence-based threat assessment teams in the schools. And then over the summer, the Safe School Advisory Committee was put together by the State Office of Education. The interim committee education chairs asked that there be some consensus between the State Office of Education and the school superintendents and from that Safe Schools Advisory Commission. And they kind of came together with their consensus recommendations, and the bill kind of came from that. Although the bill changed quite a bit, quite a few different things were taken out of the bill over the course of this session. In the end, the part that the bill had in it, which I think is a very important part, is to setting up a safe school center in our State Office of Education. So that the state office has input from the Department of Public Safety, which is an important liaison between law enforcement and the school system and the public safety system, so that they have expertise from the Department of Mental Health, because the interface of mental health with the school systems is also very important in having evidence-based safety in our schools. And also it makes it so the state office will have better ability through a software program that they're putting together to get information back from the schools about what's going on with safe school violations and violence that's happening in the schools, as well as using that tool to push out best evidence and communicate back to the schools what has happened. It gets the state office to put some resources towards getting help so that all of our schools can be better about doing a school climate survey. School climate surveys are one of our main tools to know how safe students and teachers feel when they're in the school, so you can see where danger points are, so you can see hopefully sooner where things are going badly, both for individuals as well as if there's a pattern in the school. If you don't know things are going wrong, then it's really hard to fix them. So getting best evidence about school climate surveys, about how to put them out and about how to interpret them, that the state office will be helping with that, and that'll be a good step forward. And that'll be being set up over the next couple of years, and I think other good things will come from it. The bill started with quite a few other things in it that were taken out over the course of the session, including school safety teams in the schools that got taken out. Those were intended to not be put in place until after the School Safety Center in the state office was set up. So I think there's still time to think through how we want to implement those. I think everybody agrees that we do want best evidence to be used also in the schools and not only in the state office. When we think about school safety, both about violence from others that may be committed against the school, a school shooting or an assault or a rape, but also best evidence to keep students safe from their own internal difficulties. When a student has bad anxiety or bad depression and is a threat to their own self, how do we recognize that quickly and be helpful to that student in the best way possible? There were initially some large funding allocations in the bill. Some was one-time funding for school upgrades, if you will. That could be software, that could be redesigning the school entryway to a single entry point. That money was taken out of the bill. There was money in the bill for personnel related to school safety, be that a school counselor, or a mental health counselor, or a social worker, or a student resource officer. That money was sort of taken out of the bill. In my bill, it was zeroed out, but there was another bill that had a similar amount of money for school counselors that kind of was passed almost in lieu. There was two different ways to fund school counselors, if you will, and so the other bill passed and was funded. So I didn't feel too bad because I do feel the idea of getting that counseling was honored through the legislature. But that's how it turned out, and I think it'll be a good step forward.
Thank you. And Anna, could you talk about SB 32?
Yes. Thanks for having me. I'm literally the lowest grade person who could be here to talk about this bill, so thanks for having me. SB 32 is a bill that also comes from a number of years of work. The problem that the bill was trying to address was specifically that children are appearing in juvenile court proceedings without legal representation throughout the state. So you've all heard of like the right to have an attorney regardless of your ability to pay. Adults have that right. Children also have that right. And there are lots of, it turns out, practical barriers to young people actually realizing that right throughout the state. So this bill did a couple of things trying to solve that problem of kids accessing counsel. One of the barriers that kids have to accessing legal counsel is when it comes to deciding whether a young person is, as they say, indigent and unable to afford an attorney, whose finances do you think they look at? The families, right? Most all kids, with very rare exceptions, are themselves as a person indigent and lack the resources to pay for an attorney. If their parents have the resources to pay for an attorney, there are some unique conflicts that arise. So if, for example, a court says that I, as a young person, am not indigent because my family has enough money to pay, and my parents don't want to pay for an attorney, I don't have legal counsel. We also found that kids in rural areas and kids from non-English speaking families were particularly experiencing a lot of barriers. There's a big delay that comes with waiting to meet with a public defender when you live in a rural area. And sometimes kids would just be like, I want to take responsibility. I don't want to wait another 3 weeks. I just want this to be over with. I'll go forward without an attorney. And generally that means poor outcomes for young people. They get not as beneficial dispositions, you could say. So the bill kind of takes an interesting approach by saying that children are considered indigent just by nature of their youth when they're appearing in court, so that there can be automatic appointment of counsel by the court. So if you assume every kid is going to need an attorney, you don't have to go through the process of deciding whether or not they can afford one. Everyone just gets one. So that's basically what the legislation would do, and it appropriates a bunch of money that the state can then give to counties to help them follow through on that promise of access to legal representation.
Thank you. And I'm hoping to ask both of you all of these questions. So I'm going to ask you, Anna, what has been the positive and negative feedback to this piece of legislation?
It's all positive. No, I'm just kidding. So some of the concerns about the legislation, and as with Representative Ward's bill, as he mentioned, there were multiple iterations. The final bill to pass was the fourth substitute. So you can see, like, people raise concerns, and then you tweak them based on that. I think there was a genuine concern, and a really valid one, on the part of rural counties where they just don't have a lot of financial resources, wondering, how are we going to do this, right? Like, we only have enough money to pay one contract public defender. This could really increase their workload. How are we going to afford this? And then how are we going to get the money to our county with technical assistance that will help us understand how to do the right thing. I mean, all of the counties want to do the right thing. It's just a matter of like how to actually make it happen. So there were concerns around that. This may be getting a little into the weeds, so stop me if this is super boring, really. But public defenders in some counties just have a contract with the county to defend however many kids come before the court in that year. And they're not paid enough for the good work that they do. That's sort of a given, right? And so in some counties, attorneys have to take private clients also, in addition to their public defender clients, to, make their full salary, to make all of their ends meet. So in some counties, there were concerns by public defenders that they would need to be spending much more time with their public defense clients and wouldn't be able to work with their private clients who are paying better rates and more what the attorney's time is worth. So that was one of the concerns. That makes me think one of the things that I failed to mention that was really important about this bill was that it requires that if you're a public defender for a young person appearing in juvenile court proceedings, you need to be at every proceeding, right? You can't skip some. Sometimes kids will have what are called review hearings. I almost lost it for a second, where after they get their sentence, they come back to check in. And sometimes when they come back for those check-ins, they may have exhibited some behavior that will result in a recommendation by their probation officer that they get sent to a secure care facility. And we feel like it's inappropriate for young people to not have an attorney to help them negotiate those things with them. So there were concerns about whether defense attorneys really needed to be at all of those hearings, and was that going to be too much of a burden on public defenders? I think that was the main concerns about it.
Thank you. And Representative Ward, could you speak to the positive and negative feedback you got as a result of proposing this legislation?
Well, I have Anna beat on my bill substitute number because my bill was the 6th substitute by the time it made it through. So that means there was a lot of concern about it. I think just kind of inherently when you even say, well, I'm going to run a bill about school safety, you are picking up almost just a large list of issues that society feels passionately about, but where there's people on two sides of the issue. So people are not all pulling in the same direction. I mean, as I mentioned before, this started after the mass shooting in Parkland, right? So you start with an issue that relates to guns. If you come at school safety from that angle, there's few issues that people are as passionate and pulling in different directions as guns in our society. But even past that, then you say, well, don't never mind that. Let's just talk about the architecture of the building, how we're going to build them. Well, people still pull in two different directions. Some want the schools built with more security features in the school. Others feel like that the change in the perception of safety, the perception from a school to a fortress actually is counterproductive, and so people are pulling in two different directions. Anytime you talk about, even take mental health, where you'd say, well, that's obvious we should provide more mental health at schools. That's just so clear cut. Well, it's not clear cut. When you talk about providing mental health to a minor where the parents might not want that, or where it's a different system than the parents chose, there comes a line of how much you're going to easily have available, or how much then the parents need to give their permission for the minor to get that care. Even to say, well, I have this much money available, I'm going to hire mental health counselors and social workers instead of hiring more teachers. Then you're pulling back and forth in that direction. So, and even the whole idea of law enforcement in schools itself, which to some people say, well, law enforcement just doesn't even belong in schools. There's a school to prison pipeline, and that is clearly going to make things worse for students. We want to minimize the presence of law enforcement in schools. And others say, well, no, that schools are a place where there are aggressions all the time. Students are impulsive, and there are crimes and certainly aggressions committed, and there needs to be some degree of law enforcement there to take care of that, so the students feel safe even from each other while they're there. So every point you bring up is an area of contention with respect to the bill. I think that's why several of the parts of it were taken out as it went along. I feel like what passed is a very good starting point. These issues are not issues where you pass one piece of legislation and, oh, we'll wash our hands and we're done with that, right? The issue of safety in our schools, so both things are true. So the schools are safe. So there's not shooting is the most violent thing that could happen there, or murder, but there's many other lesser things that could happen there. But also just the perception of safety separately is very important, so that students and teachers all feel safe there. Those are issues that are going to be with us always. So I guess the opposition was understandable, but in the end, I think it's a good step forward.
Thank you. And so obviously both of you have been able to speak to the fact that the legislation was passed, but there were significant amendments to both pieces of legislation. So the next question kind of, we want to address, like, what were those changes? What were the amendments that were made to the pieces of legislation? I'll let either of you take that.
Well, I think I've kind of spoken to that a little bit about the parts that were taken out of it. And I think, to me, the biggest thing that was taken out was moving forward with the school safety teams that are actually out in the schools. And to me, that's just a job that's not finished yet. There still needs to be a discussion about that. Most all schools already have some kind of crisis response team in the schools. So it's probably not important. We don't necessarily need to recreate that, but we do need to make sure that we're using best evidence in those crisis response teams, and that will just continue to be an area of focus, perhaps from the point of the legislature, perhaps just from the point of view of the state office as they put best policy in place.
Anna?
This is really embarrassing. I don't have a good answer for that. I know that through the legislative session, the substantive parts of the bill that our organization was really committed to didn't ever really change through the substitute. So as a method of sort of like efficiently focusing my time, I ignored everything I didn't have to know. So I think a lot of anytime you get a bill like this that is directed specifically at the legal system, and there are dozens and dozens of lawyers with input into the bill, there are lots and lots of minor technical changes that sort of go in over time. The bill also, there's different sections of the state law where these issues are addressed separately for juveniles and for adults. And one of the big undertakings of the bill was to sort of like put all that stuff in the same part of the law in Utah, all under Indigent Defense Services. So there was a lot of technical tweaking that just had to do with moving around big sections of code, which just attracts a lot of little necessary technical changes.
Thank you. What educational issues in Utah should be tackled next through legislation?
We're still in PTSD from the session. I haven't come up with any solutions.
No more changes. We can't.
Well, this is maybe just more a background issue that is a very large issue that will be argued about both over the summer and possibly into the coming session, and that's the huge tax reform bill that was discussed during the session and ultimately crashed out during the session, but then there was a commitment to study it during the interim, and no one really quite knows what's going to happen. But the reason for even having that discussion in the first place is because over time our general fund in the state, which pays for everything we want except education, is not quite keeping up with the growth in the population. There's enough money there for now, but it's getting closer and closer to the time when that general fund will not have enough money to pay for everything else we want, every other service the state provides except education. The education fund, which is funded by income tax, is keeping up with growth in the state, and so then there's but the reason those two funds are separate relates to a line in the Utah Constitution that says all the income tax goes into the education fund. And so there's a very, very large discussion about how are we going to avoid running out of enough money in the general fund. We don't know exactly when we'll run into that, but we kind of see that coming, and all the tax reform discussion was to try and avoid that crash. But the whole reason for the discussion is the idea that over time there is enough money in this one fund, not enough money in this other fund. How are we going to balance them out in a way that makes sense, and that every single one of the options being discussed will make changes to the way that education itself is funded. And honestly, to me, that's the biggest underlying question, is how are you going to fund education and have enough there and have everybody's needs met with good staff, good teachers, good administration there. So I don't know how that'll end up, but to me, that's the biggest issue on the table this next year.
And to that point, I think Representative Ward is absolutely right. I mean, we know a lot of the things that drive disciplinary issues in schools. A lot of them can be traced to the fact that, like, we don't have adequate staffing and teachers don't have the resources that they need to pay attention to kids who learn in different ways or are bringing traumas with them to school. So, I mean, tax policy is hugely important to what we're talking about because it sort of creates the system in which our kids are moving around. I would also say, looking ahead, we are still seeing, and we'll probably be coming up on another check-in, and I know for this group, these are not new reports, but the Finger Paints to Fingerprints report that talked about racial disparities in school discipline came out like 7 years ago now. And 3 years ago, 2 years ago, we had the follow-up, misdemeanors or misbehavior. We're running out of like really clever titles, so start thinking. Between those two, we found that overall disciplinary referrals were down, but racial disparities were not improving. In some cases, they were getting worse. So looking at the application of our discipline and why we continue to over-discipline students of color is something that we 100% have to grapple with. I also think another big issue going forward is the implementation of HB 239, the big juvenile justice reform, and Andrew Riggle and I will talk more about this in our session this afternoon. But a very small portion of that applied to schools, and it created a big amount of waves for implementation. And so I think coming back to that and seeing like how well are we implementing this general philosophy that kids are part of the school community. The answer to behavioral problems is not push out, it's inclusion and understanding. Like how do we continue to make sure that permeates our policies even as we're having these conversations about school safety? I think the final thing, and again, we'll talk about this a little more in our workshop this afternoon, is there's a lot of lip service paid to restorative justice practices in our schools. What does that mean in the context of all the other things that we're doing? How do we make that part of the everyday practice of our schooling? Not what restorative justice program are you going to choose, but like, how are these principles being incorporated into the work that we do? And that, I think we've seen a lot of really good research that shows that that can have very positive impact on school discipline and also just a safe and positive school climate and deal with some of the school safety issues that we've seen arising nationwide.
So I'm going to turn now to the questions that we've been getting from the audience. So thank you all for those who have been submitting those. The first question is for you, Representative Ward, and it's House Bill 120 includes training for school resource officers. Prior to this, we had our keynote who discussed child and adolescent development. So is that a need that's being, training with respect to child and adolescent development, is that a need that is being addressed by HB 120, and if so, how?
So HB 120, the training of student resource officers is something that the state has been paying attention to over recent years. In my mind, that's one of the most important things that we could do is have student resource officers so that the law enforcement that is in the schools understands adolescent development, if nothing else, but understands their role there, that their role there is different from a law enforcement officer on the street, and that they have an obligation to try and get the best outcome for for all the students there, including the ones who maybe they're focusing on as causing the trouble. That it's not a good solution to just say, well, I've identified the trouble, don't worry, I've arrested them, I'm taking them out of the school, so I've solved the problem. Does not count as a good outcome. But HB 120 was not the first time we started focusing and saying, hey, we want those people to be well trained. That's a process that I believe is underway within the state. Although HB 120, I think, does take a good step forward by virtue of having the school safety center at the state office, so it's got the liaison between the Department of Public Safety, which is law enforcement, and the school office, so that those two groups are communicating well with each other. And says one of the things that we want is called a model memorandum of understanding. So large school, small school, if they're going to have a student resource officer, they're going to start with kind of a basic roadmap of what is wanted when you hire that person, what training that person needs to have. The bill itself doesn't delineate and say, well, this is the training they're going to get. And you don't want that kind of detail at the level of legislation. I think we want the training to be good. We want it to be evidence-based. But I feel pretty comfortable that you don't want me and my colleagues up there being the ones to exactly designate what's going to be in that training. I think Anna agrees with me on that.
Well, I do want to say a couple of the really good things that are part of Representative Ward's bill is, as many of you are already familiar with, there's no real state oversight of school resource officers as sort of like a body of professionals, right? So each one reports to their own law enforcement agency and brings the culture of that agency into their school. There's a provision in Representative Ward's bill that directs the Board of Education to work with the Department of Public Safety, local law enforcement officers who are actually hosting school resource officers in the schools, and also the Commission on Criminal and Juvenile Justice to all get together to start talking about how to provide oversight, support, training to school resource officers as a body, which is kind of a nice thing for our state to move forward with. And Representative Ward's bill does mention that, schools should have memorandums of understanding, SROs should be trained, and that training should be linked back to the legislation that many of you were involved in a few years ago, HB 460, that sort of designates what sorts of things should be in place in order for a school resource officer to be operating effectively in a school. So those are some really good things that are part of this bill.
And to Anna, could you talk more about the over-disciplining of students of color and the systematic aspects of the school-to-prison pipeline?
Yes.
Will you?
Do people need me to? Yeah, so one of the things we know, and this is all based on data in Utah, so schools are required to report to the Office of Civil Rights at the Department of Education, and then folks here at the law school, at Voices for Utah Children, analyze that data, and it pretty much shows what parents of color and students of color have been saying already anecdotally for years and years and years, which is that there are real disparities in who is getting disciplined in schools. There's no evidence to show that anyone's behavior is any different or any worse than any other group, but certain groups, like we've seen real peaks in particularly the treatment of young women of color in schools being over-disciplined for behavior that is not inherently a disciplinary problem. So we see those, and we're also seeing like similar corollaries with kids with disabilities persistently in Utah schools. And we don't have a lot of good data on this because data collection on these things is really difficult, but there is a lot of really good qualitative data suggesting this. And Representative Ward sort of mentioned this with some of the mental health issues, but the way that gender nonconforming kids who aren't heteronormative get treated in schools and how their behavior is interpreted as disruptive or problematic. So we're seeing, what that means is that those kids are more likely to have their misbehavior interpreted as criminal misbehavior and rising from the level of an administrative punishment to a criminal justice remedy. Now, the juvenile justice reform that I discussed has been trying to move our schools away from that. So for low-level offenses, misdemeanor Cs, status offenses like truancy, schools are not to be referring those to juvenile court anymore. There need to be school-based solutions. The school community needs to handle that kind of, those kinds of issues, and they shouldn't be moving into the court. But that's where you sort of like get the most explicit pipeline into the criminal justice system, is when misbehavior in school is referred to the juvenile justice system, and then there's a whole host of different interventions and records and ramifications that can occur from that moving forward. And that's not to speak to like the more sort of difficult to pin down issues like, well, if you push a kid out of school and they don't get their high school diploma, and then like what sort of access to economic success do they have, what opportunities are available to them, and on and on and on. But those are also really important parts of the pipeline.
So I have a question. Obviously, you mentioned how there was a lot of like pushback when it came to HB 239 actually implementing restorative practices, and then we've talked about how there was funding in HB 120 that would speak to like the mental health services. There was funding there. And I'm sorry if I should know this, but I don't. Was there funding allocated to schools to implement restorative practices, or was there not funding allocated to schools so that we can speak to the restorative practices that need to be implemented? And is that kind of why we had a pushback? And could that potentially be addressed through, I mean, like right now where we have the legislation that picked up the funding for mental health services, are we kind of starting to speak to those needs, and therefore are we better equipping schools to speak to restorative practices that need to be implemented?
So I don't think that you ever will get, and frankly, I don't think that you ever should get, money given to implement restorative practices written into the bill. I think even determining what counts as a restorative practice is a matter of great debate, is not clear cut. I mean, if you did set aside money and say, I got $50 million for restorative practices, I can promise you, we would have vendors bringing in $300 million worth of things that were called restorative practices the next week, and then you would be right back trying to sort out which things you were going to fund and which things you weren't going to fund, and you would be right back at the argument of, is this legislative committee, are we going to be the smart ones that says that is a restorative practice, you get money, and that is not a restorative practice, you don't get money, or are you going to let that money largely go to the state office, and they are going to largely pass it through to the school districts, who are going to choose which practices they implement with the money that you give them, and then are you going to spend the time behind the scenes to get to where you have a culture that starts from the state office and goes throughout the schools, that restorative practices aren't something that, well, I'm not going to do that unless you give me extra money, but that is just going to be the way that you approach dealing with your students in the first place, so that the normal money that comes to you is the way that you would implement the way that you wanted to care for your students and the way you would set the community up. Does that make sense?
And from my perspective, to sort of like get to the first part of your question, in HB 239, the main thing that legislation said to schools was, you cannot refer kids to the juvenile court system anymore for misdemeanor Cs, which is like smoking, disruptive behavior, and for things like truancy and stuff like that, school-based offenses, right? So to be fair, there was no funding in the bill for those schools, and there was no direction on what they should do instead of that, right? So the schools that were relying on those practices were like, great. And so what the legislation did was, it specifically directed schools to stop doing something that we knew from Utah data was not working. It was really ineffective, and it was super expensive, and it was creating more problems than it was solving, which is what happens when you put kids in detention for truancy. Surprise, it doesn't solve the problem. But, you know, the implementation of that legislation involved folks from the Utah Board of Juvenile Justice and Representative Snow traveling around the state, hearing the unique concerns of the different communities, and also the Utah State Board of Education working with districts on what they could do instead, right? So like giving them restorative justice training. There was a specialist hired at the Utah State Board of Education to do that. And then there were community-based trainers who were going to schools and helping them understand not specifically how to do restorative justice in their schools, but what are some other options that you might use to deal with some of these lower level offenses in lieu of court referrals, and to start brainstorming with schools like what would work for them and what would play to the strengths of their unique school communities. So yeah, I would love to see more resources. And like Representative Ward was saying, yeah, it should definitely be directed by experts on the ground who have experience. And we have many in this room right now that have been doing this for a long time who can be helpful in providing that kind of technical assistance.
Thank you both. Kind of on that same train of thought is the question about the piece of legislation that picked up the funding that would have been allocated to school counselors.
Yeah.
Is that the same or a larger amount, and is it restricted to school counselors only or school counselors and others?
So the amount of money the ongoing amount of money in that other bill was very close. In the end, the budget always, little changes get made at the last second, but it was $27 million ongoing that got put towards that. The initial ask in my bill had been 30, but even had my bill passed with the money in my bill, I'm sure that amount would have been moved up and down. So that's pretty darn close. And it gave a list of kinds of professionals that could be hired. I think counselors was on there, social workers was on there, school nurses was on there. In that particular bill that did pass instead of mine, student resources officers was not on the list. And it was structured pretty differently. It was a one-to-one matching grant program. So the state set aside this pool of money and said, hey, if you want to hire one of those folks, then you the school, use money we already gave you and pay half of it. And then if you apply and write this list of goals that you're going to achieve and promise that you'll follow up and tell us how you were doing on your goals, then we'll, from this pool of money, kick in the other half of the cost of hiring that person.
Thank you. And on House...
Chamber?
Oh.
And thank you for that.
I maybe just became not Representative Ward's least favorite person in this room.
Their local law enforcement agency.
The other LEA.
The other LEA. It's all LEA. Well, they're always going to, I mean, I think by definition, law enforcement in the school is going to be unique and have not two hats, but two worlds to whom they have to answer, right? And so we're asking them to do a different kind of task, to be familiar with and behave in a way that makes sense in a school setting that is very unique, but also to understand the rules that govern law enforcement, to be familiar with those and behave in an honorable and effective and well-trained fashion with respect to the rules that exist in the world of law enforcement. And whether or not you were going to make it easier to sue them would you'd have to make that case, and frankly, I'm well outside my area of expertise in discussing those rules. Hmm? Sure. I mean, well, but if you start from the place of saying, well, this person is likely to harm children and they're likely to be a predator, and how can I make sure that this person is not a predator? And let me put everything in place. I mean, this is starting from a different place of saying this person is there to protect my community, and I largely trust them. And I mean, you have to have rules in place that face both ways.
That is 100% true. Thank you. Sorry, Camper.
So thank you for your question. It's really interesting to address that kind of area of the different legislation that we're passing. Another really interesting question that I would like to put to both of you is that somebody submitted is, are we overemphasizing the role of law enforcement in making our schools healthy and safe places? Could we reduce the need for law enforcement in schools if we put significant resources into making schools psychologically healthy places?
Yes.
I'm really not sure. I am not sure of that at all. I mean, you have I can only speak to my high school has several counselors, a couple of social workers, a good bunch of teachers that are there, a good bunch of administration. They have one SRO that's there, one person's there. I'm from white bread, bountiful, but that person is largely well respected by the students that I know, and they're glad to have that person there, and I feel like it's worked out well. I don't know if one person versus 10 to 15 who are there because of mental health and refining counselors. I don't know if that's the right balance or not, but it doesn't start to me seeming like it's obvious that that's out of balance.
Do you have any response to that, Anna?
Well, I think I don't know is always the better answer, quite frankly, than just yes. I think, well, if we're operating in the realm of like reality, right? There's schools that have SROs
an important realm,
in them, right? And it's like there's schools that have SROs in them, and if the school community has gone that way for whatever reason, there are better ways of doing it, right? I think Salt Lake City Police Department and the district just announced a really good sort of exemplary way of approaching that with a really strong memorandum of understanding and rules and training about how to make their relationship as productive as possible. I do think that it's helpful to think outside of the box on these things, and especially with education, just because there's always so much going on in the education world with different policies being proposed and new approaches and all this stuff. I think it's easy and understandable to sort of like focus on what we have and sort of like work with that. But I think thinking outside the box about the role that the SRO is playing, is that the most appropriate person to be filling that role? People are using them creatively, and I think there are a lot of good SROs out there that are doing the informal mentoring and the informal counseling and, you know, providing a lot of the mental health supports that we've been talking about. But you know, does that need to be the way that those things are delivered to students? What are some of the things that flow out of that? So I think it's always worth looking at, right? And to also be asking really good questions about, you know, where those solutions get proposed from and what the intent is behind that, and then what are just some of the consequences unintended that flow from that. So I do think, just in our communities, we put a lot of stuff on police officers that they are not paid to handle, they're not trained to handle, they're not best equipped to handle. And I think even the broader community would benefit from just kind of like thinking outside the box on how we can tackle some of these problems.
So to me, there is an underlying idea that always seems to percolate along in these discussions, and that is the idea that is that for someone I talk with them, it seems like the only way they regard law enforcement as being damaging. And you can give you they damage this person, they damage this person, they damage this group of people disproportionately. And so every way we interact with them is, since we know they damage people, is to reduce their influence and cut back what they do. And you can make those long lists of damage things, but I have a fundamental belief that we need law enforcement to function well. I don't disagree with the things on the list, but in my mind, there are a lot of good things that come to us from having law enforcement in our communities that we would not have if we did not have law enforcement in our communities. To me, it's kind of like your immune system in your body. I can give you a long list of autoimmune diseases and say, look, this immune system caused that person to have diabetes, and it gave this person rheumatoid arthritis, and it crippled this person's joints up. So let's just eliminate that. Okay, you die of cancer and an infection the next week. That system needs to be in its right balance, but you really can't get along without it. And to me, that's how I think of it. We're looking for the right balance of law enforcement, the right training for law enforcement. I do not feel like the solution is just to eliminate it entirely.
So I just wanted to say thank you, Representative Ward, for all the work you do for our kids. I love your scientific, very cognitive approach. I'm not usually in that cognitive space. And importantly, about your sex ed bill that we worked on. So thank you. And Anna, I think you're a badass. So I think I'm looking for synthesis, and I think we'd be remiss to discuss what the consequences, like Anna just spoke to, of what these bills have done on the ground in our schools, in our community. I'll speak specifically to Salt Lake School District. We definitely need everything you've done on the Hill. I'm grateful. We'll battle with you side to side. But this year, I'm going to keep it real. It's been major backlash in our district. And we have all these things in place. And basically what happened is we put it all out there in the law, and then we get these tensions between SROs, police, law enforcement, LEAs, right, and our schools. And so what happened was all these things go into place, and the SROs this year went, oh, we're not touching it. Oh, you handle it. You go ahead and use those restorative justice practices you have, and I'm going to go ahead and go over here and have a cup of coffee and watch how that works out for you. So this year, it's been a complete backlash, not any fault of anyone's, except for we don't have a true understanding and a relationship between law enforcement, our communities of color, our schools, our students. And until we have that relationship, and I love, again, being a health teacher, your immune system analogy, I'm going to sit with that for a few days. That's kind of fun. But it also doesn't respect the historical institutional racism within law enforcement. And I had this conversation with amazing retired Chief Andrew Weirden last night over drinks after the Cesar Chavez Award about what it really needs to look like on the ground between law enforcement and our communities of color, which are typically the most marginalized and in that school to prison pipeline. So I love the structures in place within our district alone. Also, those of us that do the restorative justice work every year, we've been individually kind of taken out by our own school district, our own community, and all of a sudden, people that are powerhouses in restorative justice are having to find new jobs next year, are just kind of silenced, and some of us teachers are told, just close your door and do it in your room. So I love we have structure, I love we have the money to do it, and I'm grateful for it, but we need your help now as allies to synthesize and actually make it work and show up for our communities of color. Thank you.
Can you not walk away from the microphone yet? So in order to synthesize it, to make it work, and do you perceive that the legislature is the one that you want to have that happen, or to whom are you appealing to help that happen?
I'll be really honest, I don't have much hope in Utah politics at this point for my communities of color. As a Latina, as a fierce ally for Black Lives Matter, part of the LGBTQ community, I believe it has to be with us, for us, by us, and it be driven with our white allies. And I hate putting that on our community because no one should put that on our communities, but in all reality, we're the ones that get the job done. So asking you as allies to show up for us and be in our spaces, which you have done, Anna, you're always by our side. But we need to have those conversations, like real sit down. I mean, let's run some circles with some officers. And I think that, I don't know how it looks, but I know that we have historically run up against the same thing. I mean, we just had Jamal Hall in North Ogden get shot 11 times, and he had 2 knives in his hands. School to prison pipeline. He was a high school athlete, all-star. And cops showed up, 3 different agencies, shot him 11 times while he was already down. We got to have these conversations, and they have to be real ones, not just policy. We definitely need the policy to back it, but we've got to just have just real-life conversations.
If you could just wave your wand and change anything, would it be statute you would change, or would it be school policy you would change, or would you say, no, the policies are okay, but what is going wrong is just actual things on the ground, even despite the policies?
If I could wave my fabulous Chicana wand that's really tired right now, I would wave it over people's hearts, minds, and souls that has been historically the way it is, right? Mm-hmm. I wish I had an answer for that.
Okay.
But it's really, I believe it's the individuals in the spaces and trying to win them over one by one.
Sure. Okay.
Thank you for asking.
Yeah.
Well, and from my experience, I've heard from many people who are smarter on this topic than me, that, ironically, like, that is kind of the whole basis of, like, the restorative approach to things, right? Is, like, the building of relationships. And Representative Ward is right. Like, it can't always happen statutorily. In fact, sometimes that's the worst way for it to happen. But I do think, to sort of, like, be cognizant of exactly the things that you shared, Chelsea, and to make sure that those are always part of the policy conversation. Like, no, you don't want the legislature to write a bill that says, like, here's how every school is supposed to do restorative justice. It would never happen, and nobody would like it, right? But as we're moving forward, we can, and this is something that Andrew and I will talk about a little bit, and that we've gotten a lot of feedback from folks in this room about, is like, well, what is restorative justice? And when different things get proposed that specifically impact our schools, can we sort of like look at it with that lens and say, how could we make this more in keeping with that philosophy? Because you can't always apply philosophies to statute, right? There's nothing, and we do it all the time. So I think that there are ways to make sure that those things are attended to in policy conversations, even if they're not being legislated.
Well, and I want you to know that any of us that are in the classroom or in the communities doing the work, I'm so grateful that you two are handling that, because I have no desire to sit in that very toxic white space that doesn't understand most of what's going on. So I am grateful that you're there doing that work so I can do the work here with my community. I think it's powerful to have allies, and you guys are definitely our allies, so thank you.
And thank you, Chelsea. I think this question kind of speaks to the underlay of the fact that creating legislation that really is representative of what the community wants is by having conversations with community stakeholders and everybody who is who's going to be impacted by any legislative changes we make. So a question that somebody posed for both of you is, how did constituents help your bills advance?
Rarely. I guess, I don't know, to me, as a legislator, it's almost like two worlds. You have certain projects that you get started on. So like for me, this was a big project, and I spent an awful lot of time on it. But it was a project that was important because it was important to the state as a whole. It was not a project that I started because my constituents in my district came and said, "This is the project that we want you to do." And although I have run some bills like that have been for a particular constituent who brought me the idea for it, and I'm like, "That's a good idea. We should fix that." That still, the person brought me the idea. It wasn't necessarily only my constituents. So you're always trying to balance as a legislator what does make sense for the whole state, and what does, if my district does have an attitude, a gestalt of how do I best represent them, but those aren't always just the identical thing.
Anna, do you have anything that you would add to just the work that you did with, I guess it would more be because you are a constituent that was advocating for this, the change that was made for SB 32. So could you speak to like working with other people and like whether or not that impacted the
Yeah, I mean, I think, and a lot of it gets down to like how you want to actually define constituents, right? Like the stakeholders I work with are different than the people that Representative Ward has like a legislative responsibility to represent who live in his district. So like there's a lot of different ways that you could define constituent. I think that from the bill that we worked on, I mean, Representative Ward is absolutely right. Like there's just a huge process that happens much earlier than any legislative session, right? Like ideally you're working on something for years before it comes to a legislative proposal. And
first day to open bill files for next year is May 4th.
See? And you'll learn pretty quick in the process, like most of the conversations are happening before and after the session, as they should be, right? When you have the time to include people and talk through these different things. I do think, our bill in particular, in a way, was entirely driven by constituents in the fact that, Camber and others went around the state and observed what was happening in juvenile courts to see if the concerns we had were being borne out and in what way, right? And so then the legislation was structured to make sure that the problem was being solved in the way that we were seeing it observed. So the experiences of those constituents that we observed shaped the policy. And then, once we got it to the point where it's at the Capitol, and Representative Ward's right, it's just like madness, and Chelsea's right, like it's really hard to understand like how to insert in that weird little 45-day process, which is why you spend so much time before and after trying to get it right. I think that, the people who follow us on social media and read our blog posts and get excited about what we do and then contact their individual legislators, I think it can help, even if a legislator voted for something and you reach out to the person in your district and you say, you know what, thank you. That was really important to me. Here's a personal experience I've had in the juvenile justice system, and what you're doing is really great. That can really give people a push to move things in the right direction. So I think that can be really helpful.
So I do believe that we're out of time, and I know that I wasn't able to address all the questions that everybody asked, but I want you to join me in thanking you two for both being here. We really appreciate you taking the time to talk to us about the legislative updates. So.
Thanks. And?
Yeah, so now we have, not of the event, but, so now we have, we're setting up lunch out in the, in rooms 6619 and 6623, so feel free to kind of meander through the pre-function space. I think we still have some leftovers from breakfast, coffee, tea, hot chocolate as well, so feel free to make your way to our lunch space, and we can feed ourselves, regroup, get renourished, and get ready to get back at it for the breakout sessions that'll happen this afternoon.
I know, it's actually going to happen.
Everybody was saying, well, this one will be easy when they get, they'll get it, right?
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I think it is.
And I remember like starting to sweat. So I'm glad they turned out to be right.
Yeah.
The graphic.
There's somebody.